My name is Ted Gerber. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to this week's lecture in our regular series sponsored by the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia, also known as CREECA. I'm the faculty director of CREECA, and we have one more lecture on our calendar. So before I introduce our speaker for today, let me tell you that next week, same time, same place, we will be hearing from Karesh Shank, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at Nazarbayev University, and she will be talking about Eurasian responses to the COVID-19 crisis between fact and fear. So please do visit our website, which is creeca.wisc.edu, to see more information about this and other future events. So just a few logistical things. Our custom in our lectures is to ask people to mute their mics and their videos for the lecture, and also hold questions to the end. And when the speaker is finished, we'll moderate the questions and discussion, and we ask people, to use the raise hand button under the participants key to indicate that you have a question, and then turn on your mic and camera when you're acknowledged. Also, we now are asking people to introduce yourselves briefly when you ask your questions, so we know, so the speaker and everybody else, knows who you are, just briefly. Also, as you probably already heard, today's presentation will be recorded. So then finally, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Erica Marat, who is the Associate Professor at the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And I first became acquainted with Dr. Marat's research many years ago. We were just chatting when I read a lot of her reporting on Central Asian societies in the Eurasian Daily Monitor. However, since then, her research is broadened. She focuses on violence mobilization, security institutions, policing in Eurasia, India, and Mexico. And her very well-received book called The Politics of Police Reform, Society Against the State in Post-Soviet Countries, appeared with Oxford University Press in 2019. And in that book, she explores the conditions in which meaningful transformation of police is likely to succeed and when it will fail. So obviously very relevant and topical given what we're experiencing with respect to discussions about police reform in the United States today. However, of course, Dr. Marat examines not the United States, but post-Soviet countries in that book. Today, however, she's going to be talking about a different but related topic, and that is technological solutions for complex problems, emerging electronic surveillance regimes in Eurasian cities. So it's a delight to welcome Dr. Marat, and I'll turn the floor over to her now.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And the research that I'm going to present today, it is published as an article in Europe-Asia Studies, and the early drafts of that article were discussed as part of Quanar's meeting. Was it 2 years ago? It feels like it was eternity ago in St. Petersburg, where you were present, and Catherine Henley, who's also here, was there. I thought it was a great place to discuss the earlier drafts of this paper. So I am delighted to be here, and I'll start with this. So when I studied police reform programs in former Soviet space, I kept hearing this buzzword: smart city, safe city, smart city, everywhere I went. And in Moscow, Sobyanin promised hundreds of thousands of surveillance cameras across the city to blanket the city so the city becomes smarter and safer. The mayor of Kyiv, Klitschko, also promised tens of thousands of surveillance cameras in central parts of Kyiv, but also in the more traversed areas of the city, and even cities as small as Dushanbe in Tajikistan also embarked on those ambitious, smart, and safe city projects and installed dozens of cameras that recognized license plates in central parts of Dushanbe. And if we look across Eurasia or post-Soviet space, we can really see that the smart city and safe city projects are arising all around, both in the big cities, but also in smaller cities. And this map has to be updated every 6 months because new projects come about every now and then. And the Chinese companies like Huawei, Hikvision, they dominate the space. There are also Russian projects by Rostelecom or Rostech, and several Western projects like Cisco, and yeah, pretty much Cisco, but and IBM. But Huawei really dominates the space, and you can see this kind of red circle that is present all across. And to me, this really reminds this concept of by Jasanoff and Kim, Dreamscapes of Modernity, when it's a notion that describes a collective vision of technological advancement as a way of creating specific sociological outcomes. So by expanding technological innovation in urban spaces, the cities, so from Moscow to Kyiv to Dushanbe to Nur Sultan, really trying to achieve some kind of sociological outcomes. And very often it is a more orderly society with fewer crimes and fewer problems. And the question I ask in my research is, what are the changes? How are smart technologies changing public spaces and cities across Eurasia? In my article, I mostly focus on Kyiv, Almaty, and Bishkek, but today I'll expand my research to other cities as well. And in the article, I really did mostly conduct discourse analysis. So I looked at city plan programs. So in Russian, it's known as Genplan. It is a relic from the Soviet regime when cities planned their development for the next 5 to 10 years. I reviewed media reports that reported on smart and safe city technologies. I looked at statements by mayors and agencies. I looked through contracts with foreign firms, both on municipal and national level, and I conducted interviews mostly with urban authorities, municipal authorities. And I did, now as part of a different project, I'm engaging in some quantitative comparison. I'm going to present for one of the cases a little bit of a quantitative overview, but that's just, that's more of an emergent research that I'm conducting in collaboration with another scholar. So I entered this research trying to look what are the domestic processes for installing this kind of cameras and this kind of surveillance regimes. And this was really an outgrowth of my research of just generally law enforcement in former Soviet space. And what I noticed is that that there is really a local demand for surveillance, for this innovative way of policing behavior. And these are the examples of some of the signs of what kind of behavior is not welcomed in Almaty. So no spitting or no littering. And it really, to me, this resonates with the argument that recently presented by Rosenfeld on the autocratic middle class. It's this kind of, in the case of policing in urban areas, it's this long-term urban class that is economically autonomous, but still expects the state to engage in daily lives and to order daily life in accordance to the urban residents' interests. It also resonates with some of the research that is also emerging, the urban studies in the urban studies domain of how urban residents now in Eurasia, so after the crazy 1990s and 2000s, when urban dwellers were renovating their private spaces, so engaging in what's known Eurasian, beautifying their private spaces, apartments or homes, are now turning their attention to the aesthetics of the public space. And kind of from the words of one employee of Almaty mayor's office is, urban dwellers in Almaty, so the long-term urban middle class, are really tired seeing some Stroy. So I guess in English it's splash dash building. I don't know, Ted, you may help me with translation. Was street retail, was chaotic, advertising billboards covering the city. And they wanted a more beautiful public space. And the cameras are helping to create this public space where disorderly behavior, or behavior that doesn't conform with this vernacular notions of urbanity, of what it means to be an urban person, is policed better. And at this point, when I present my research, I often hear students ask me, but what do you actually mean? Do you mean smart or do you mean safe here? Because those are two different notions. Because smart refers to this idea that life within a city becomes easier. You can use your cell phone to pay for services, for public transportation. You can access services. There's Wi-Fi hotspots available, and all those great things that make life within a city seamless and more comfortable. But safe is a more contested category. It is a subjective category that defines what is disorderly and what is criminal behavior, and it's very often politicized, and in Eurasian context, including exposes deep political and economic and social divides. So when I talked to police officers in Kyiv, for instance, their understanding, and also civil society, in fact, often refers to of what is an urban behavior within Kyiv, and what is not living up to this idea of urbanity is has a lot of parallels with what kind of population within Kyiv accepts the changes brought about by Euromaidan and the ideals of Euromaidan, behaving in a more European or politically open way. And I know I'm kind of rumbling here, but in individuals who are not accepting the changes, who are still kind of locked in their past, and the way they behave doesn't really live up to the ideals of Euromaidan. And so when I walked around Kyiv with police officers, they looked at individuals, and there was a specific case when they had to confront a middle-aged man who was shouting at them and saying, "You guys, I don't believe. What did you do with the country? I don't believe in the changed regime. Ukraine was good as it was." Things like that kind of opposed the Euromaidan changes and ideals. And the police officers were, of course, a representation of the new regime. They were newly hired new police officers. And they spent some time with that man and trying to explain to him what how his behavior is wrong, and that resonates also with how Klitschko presents surveillance cameras in central Kyiv. What kind of crowds he wants to monitor, and what kind of even emotions. And so he goes as far as to explaining that those cameras can focus on human emotions and determine when there is a malintention in people and preempt this kind of behavior. And this idea, and these two notions, the smart and safe, they're used interchangeably in the Eurasian context. So when very often when Sobyanin or Klitschko or mayors in Almaty, Bishkek, or Dushanbe, when they speak about smart and safe, they use them interchangeably. Usually they refer to smart city technologies, but what they actually mean is safe city technologies. And sometimes they just say safe technologies, so безопасный город, или умный город. So, but the reference here is mostly on safe city technologies, so the more politicized category. But I quickly realized in my research that the domestic picture is not enough. There are also international powers at play. So I'm a comparative political scientist, but I did have to look at more of what's happening on an international arena. And very much in Susan strange argument. There might be varied domestic demand for goods and services, but then there's also availability of products, services, and capital by external firms, external powers, and they just happen to align in the same place. And I identified two major external drivers of domestic innovation. The first one is global prestige. It just became really fashionable to have a smart city. And again, that really means safe city in the Eurasian context. Mayors often, when they propose innovations within a city, they refer to global ranks. And there's a dozen of smart city indices out there that compare different cities to each other and identify global leaders. And of course, those ratings, they are overwhelmingly Eurocentric. They define an ideal smart city based on a model in Scandinavia. But of course, the social patterns and behavior really is different from even global north and global south. But still, those ratings, they often appear in references by mayors when they introduce innovations. In Central Asia, references, especially in Kazakhstan, so in Nur Sultan, the capital of Kazakhstan, the references are more Asia-centric, so South Korea, so Seoul or Hong Kong or Singapore. But when we look at a more Western part of former Soviet space, it's really London, New York. Those are the ideals for Kyiv and Moscow and other cities. So that's one. So there's this notion of global prestige, and there are a certain benchmark associated with what a modern urban space looks like. And then there is also more of a really this IR notion of China and Russia competition, and especially China's rise as a global power in innovation, in technological innovations. And of course, in China, both in China and Russia, those innovative projects in technology, they're closely linked to government's foreign policy, foreign and domestic policy, more so, of course, than in the United States or in the European Union, though we also see in the Western context how that's also becoming more interlinked. Chinese firms, Huawei, Hikvision, and several other smaller companies, they have a pattern of inviting mayors or heads of states or ministers to their headquarters in Beijing or Shanghai, and impressing, and here in the picture is Ms. Yoyev visiting Huawei, impressing them by their cutting edge technologies, and kind of selling the idea that they can offer this unprecedented innovation to the urban spaces in their respective countries. So there's that. There's the push by corporations connected to governments to innovate, very often offering favorable financial also terms for innovation. And China, of course, is nowhere to be compared to Russia. Russia is a lot less dominating in the world, even in Eurasia. But Russian projects are slowly taking root in some cities. So in Bishkek, Vega is from Rostech is the company that supplies several dozen of surveillance cameras that identify mostly license plates. And then also, both countries, of course, have national strategies on innovation and then expanding their innovative programs around the world. If you read literature on China's technological innovations, you really get a lot of references to China trying to harvest as much data as possible from around the world to then improve its artificial intelligence capabilities. And Huawei and other Chinese firms, they cater to this political goal by China. Russia is trying to use, in Eurasia, Russia is trying to use regional platforms, in this case, Eurasian Economic Union, to try to at least coordinate efforts to come up with technological innovations and can create a shared space for technological innovation. I see this as an attempt to at least have an oversight on the rapid expansion of Chinese technologies in Eurasia, but also as a way maybe to push for more Russian products by Russian government agencies. So Rostech and Rostelecom are, of course, government agencies in Russia. So back to my question, what do we have? What is the result of these domestic and international pressures or sources for change? And I see the emergence of roughly 3 different surveillance regimes in former Soviet space. And they really show more of where does the power over innovation lies, and control over innovation lies. So the first one is local surveillance afforded by wealthier cities like Moscow, Nur-Sultan, Almaty, cities that really generating a lot of profit and are the economic drivers within a country. Moscow in Russia, and Almaty, especially in Kazakhstan. Almaty mayor's office, they boast themselves to be contributing almost a quarter to the state budget in terms of its economic activity. And they're driven by international prestige. So these are wealthy cities with really dense economic activity. They're driven by international prestige for innovation. The statements by mayors really refer mostly to this idea that in order to be even wealthier, even more modern, we're living up to these benchmarks, and often cite different cities that are considered to be more innovative than others. And decisions a lot of times take on a municipal level. So within mayor's office, and at times also overriding or complementing local law enforcement or municipal law enforcement efforts. They do represent, and the surveillance cameras, and again, I'm talking mostly about surveillance cameras here. They complement and expand law enforcement functions. So now mayor's offices are also engaging in law enforcement in addition to interior ministries or interior ministry branches on a city level. Those cities, they do also expand smart elements of a city. So again, comfort of living within a city, payment systems, Wi-Fi hotspot, and so on. But still, smart and safe city innovations mostly have to do with law enforcement. Because the decisions are taken on a municipal level, they can also really quickly adjust to changing conditions, changing demands. One example is a year ago during lockdown, when the pandemic just started to spread. All these cities, all 3 cities, they repurposed their surveillance cameras from the traditional kind of criminal and disorderly behavior that they policed, be that on the streets of people or with motorists or traffic regulations. So they repurposed them to police people who violated lockdown measures. This is an example of how one man in Moscow, he exited his apartment building to throw away trash. His face was recorded in surveillance cameras, and then next thing he knows, Uchastkové, so police officers show up in his doorstep and penalize him. So this surveillance regime for pandemic didn't survive for too long, but it was quickly, the speed with which it was scaled up during the pandemic and repurposed was quite impressive in all those 3 cities. And there are many, many stories like that as well, how this really minute behavior was surveilled and then penalized in all these three cities during the first lockdown. Then there are hybrid control regimes, and Kyiv is one of the examples of such regime. And decisions are really made still on a municipal level because those are big cities with quite sizable economic power. They do focus on law enforcement aspects. There isn't much emphasis on smart aspects of smart cities or safe cities. They usually, because it's mostly law enforcement, I think, and because it's also in the case of Kyiv, it's a more democratic environment. Smart and safe city innovations, they are really accompanied, which really strike me a lot, with elaborate narratives about what they represent. And by that, I mean that Klitschko, over and over again, he refers to the same emotional stories of how cameras help to prevent kidnapping of a small child from daycare and really capture perpetrators before they left the perimeter of the city. And this story comes up again and again. Similarly, he refers to a fugitive who's been on the run for 15 years and then finally captured in one of the train stations in Kyiv. And thankfully to these technologies, this was possible. Very much reinforces result-oriented policing, relying on the statistics of captured fugitives or perpetrators, crimes solved. This result-oriented element is also present in Kazakhstan, I should say, that suddenly they present the effectiveness of those cameras through statistics. And of course, there is no discussion of what kind of crime and crime prevention or investigation takes place outside of areas where cameras are not present. And that it's the statistics overshadows just the general narrative of what it means to be safe and within a city. And then also at this point in Kyiv, it's really hard to tell whether the data just stays within the city and just innovations with the data and the use of data is just on the city level or even on a national level, or is it now also shared with international companies, and especially with Hikvision, Huawei and Hikvision, especially in Kyiv, because Hikvision is one of the very few providers of technologies. So I should have said that in the welfare cities, they pick and choose from a menu of different vendors. So it's not just the one company dominating the space, but it's a mixture of Chinese, European, local, and Western companies that are present. Kyiv now has mostly Chinese companies present, and here are the questions, and also kind of expressed by some journalists and society activists expressed concern that maybe data is shared. And the power is narratives is very important here. And this kind of goes to the project that I'm conducting currently on just generally China-Russian expansion in different contexts. And you know, I'm not trying to draw a clear line between the presentation of smart city technologies by Ukrainian media and Ukrainian authorities, but I think, but what I'm trying to show here in the ecosystem, in the discursive ecosystem in which they occur. So these are data extracted from GDELT project. It's a data set, it's a global data set on, it has to do with tone, GDELT. Anyways, I just was speaking about it this morning. It's an analysis of Chinese, and in this particular case, and of Chinese, Russian, Ukrainian, and other sources. So mostly Western dominated sources. Frankly, I can talk more about it, how we selected the sources and the other category in Q&A section. But just general discourse of China-Ukraine relations. And the gray bell curve shows coverage of Chinese media and the tone of Chinese media. So right from zero, from the center, is more positive tone of coverage, and the positive would be more like collaboration, agreement. So these words would be automatically coded as positive. And so Chinese, and this we see this really perfect curve, bell curve, across different contexts, that Chinese media seem to have a very controlled messaging about their engagement in the world. Ukrainian media is also more on the positive side, although it veers towards a neutral tone. And then the other sources, again, mostly dominated by Western sources, tend to be really negative about China-Ukraine relations. And this happens again and again across different contexts in Eurasia, but also in the world, how international media depicts Chinese engagement in different countries as negative, whereas Chinese depiction and even local depiction tends to be more positive. And this is just to say that the engagement and the right side here, the right graph plot, it shows specifically cooperation events in which cooperation on smart city technologies would fall. And here again, it's mostly positive coverage of engagements, whereas international media tends to be more neutral. Chinese-Ukrainian relations are not that expansive compared to, let's say, China and Central Asia. And one of the main aspects of Chinese-Ukrainian relations is, in fact, cooperation with Huawei. So somewhere in those in these plots, there would be mentions also of Huawei and Hikvision installment of smart city technologies in Ukraine as well. And that also here it shows just in terms of frequency, Chinese media cover really extensively their engagement in Ukraine, and followed by Ukrainian, followed by other sources, so kind of sources around the world, and then also by Ukrainian sources. But the Chinese, in a way, we could interpret here that the Chinese sources, they try to dominate the narrative, right? Dominate the narrative on what is it that Chinese-Ukrainian relations look like. And we see those dynamics again and again across Eurasia, where Chinese have both the most numerous and most controlled messaging on their relationship with the countries in Eurasia. And this is, on the right side, is just the coverage in general on Chinese-Ukrainian relations. There has been a peak in 2017. Again, I don't want to draw a direct relationship between the expansion of smart city technologies and the coverage. We still need to dig deeper and see specifically what was covered in that period of time. But there is they do coincide. They do coincide with the expansion of smart cities in Ukraine and that period of time, and just the general coverage by the media overall in general. The cutoff for us is really before the pandemic began, so we're not analyzing the news sources that were affected by the coverage of pandemic. All right, so now the third type of regime is really outsourced services. And smaller cities with smaller economic activity, and in a way, economically not as prosperous cities like Bishkek, Dushanbe, Yerevan, they really have just one or two vendors. Most of the time, one vendor. So Dushanbe and Yerevan, they mostly collaborate with Huawei. Decisions there are made on a national level, not on the municipal level. So the municipal authorities, they're not even involved in contracting with activities with the vendors, or really maybe they sometimes may decide and advise on where the cameras should be installed, but the decisions are really made on ministerial level. Usually it's telecommunication authorities together was Prime Minister's office. And then really what's striking about those cities, and it's really an unfortunate picture, I should say, is that this is a way of monetizing crime. So the contracts are built so that every time a violator is captured on camera, so be that a motorist was as a license plate or a person's face, and then those individuals, violators, are then put in a system where they would have to pay for their violations, right? The number of fines collected from the population really increased dramatically in those countries, especially in the first few months. But the structure is such that every time authorities collect fines from the population, part of it goes into financing the loan. So what the incentive structure here is really inverted. It's really much easier for authorities to have people keep violating and paying off the loans. And this really undermines the incentive for improving infrastructure and just conditions, be that more comprehensive, complex conditions in terms of labor relations or protections and participation of civil society in deciding what kind of city do we want, to really improving conditions on the roads and building more coherent traffic patterns and all those things that would prevent people from violating rules on the streets. There is really no sense, I got no sense that there is really control of data. So for Kyrgyzstan, Vega, the Rostech's firm, I guess, agency, Vega, that invested into smart cameras on the streets in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek. The cloud, Prism is located in Russia. There's not even a discussion or any statements by authorities on where the data goes, where the data from violators or just any data just that is harvested on the streets goes. And again, there is really no incentive to reform. So summing up here, there are three different types of law enforcement regimes emerge as based on the surveillance, expansion of surveillance technologies. One is local control, driven by prestige in wealthier cities like Moscow, Nur-Sultan, Almaty. Then there is the hybrid control, where there's still local decision making, but the emphasis is on law enforcement. That is not to say that prestige is also driven by law enforcement, but the prestige is one of the features of local control as well. And then there's the third one is outsourced, and it's really monetizing crime. It is monetizing crime for authorities that are trying to, if I'm blunt, extract equity from citizens. All of these regimes, they cater to more autocratic tendencies, and there is very little discussion on who is watching whom. So if we look at, again, going back to Susan Strange's question, where does the power lie? Here, the question would be who is watching whom. There was no discussion of that whatsoever in the Eurasian context. Now, beyond Eurasia, what we find in Eurasian, in the dynamics Eurasia, in the developments in Eurasia, we can see that modernity and authoritarianism, so the strive to modernize and also to expand authoritarianism, they go hand in hand. And I drew this inspiration from studies of Stalinism. So you can kind of see the pattern, sort of the how history rhymes. It's often a substitute to an ineffective state, and very often looks for quick fixes to complex problems. And I think this is generally the case for a lot of cities around the world, including in the United States. right, that concludes my presentation.